The late afternoon sun cast golden rays through the tall windows of La Belle, one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ornate ceiling, casting prismatic light across white linen tablecloths and gleaming silverware. The air hummed with the quiet conversations of wealthy patrons, the gentle clink of fine china, and the soft notes of a pianist playing in the corner. This was a place where reservations were made months in advance, where a single meal could cost more than most people earned in a week. Stood at the hostess station, his designer suit perfectly tailored, his watch worth more than a luxury car. At 28 years old, he was the only son of tech billionaire William, founder of Industries, a multinational corporation that had revolutionized artificial intelligence and cloud computing. Had grown up in a world of private jets, yacht parties, and exclusive galas. He had never heard the word no, never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of, never encountered a problem that his father's money couldn't solve. Behind him stood three of his friends, all cut from the same cloth. There was Brent, whose father owned a chain of luxury hotels, Justin Park, heir to a pharmaceutical empire, and Tyler, whose family controlled half the commercial real estate in New York City. They were laughing loudly, already several drinks into their afternoon, their voices carrying across the elegant dining room in a way that made other guests glance over with disapproval. The hostess, a young woman named with nervous eyes and trembling hands, looked down at her reservation book. She had worked at La Belle for only 3 months, and every day felt like walking through a minefield. One wrong move with the wrong guest could end her career in fine dining before it truly began. Leaned against the podium, his breath carrying the sharp scent of expensive whiskey. His eyes were slightly unfocused, his movements just a bit too loose. He had started drinking at lunch, moved to his club for more drinks, and now had arrived here with his friends for dinner, though it was barely 5 in the evening. The hostess cleared her throat softly and spoke in her most professional voice. She explained that while she would love to accommodate them, every table was reserved for the evening. The restaurant had been fully booked for weeks. Perhaps they could make a reservation for another night? She could check availability for next month. Stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. His face slowly transformed from casual arrogance to genuine shock, then to something darker. His jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed. He straightened up from the podium, his full height suddenly imposing. He asked if she knew who he was. His voice had lost its casual tone, replaced by something cold and sharp. Swallowed hard, she didn't know who he was. Everyone who worked in upscale Manhattan establishments knew the family. But rules were rules, and the restaurant manager had been very clear. No matter who asked, if there were no tables, there were no tables. The fire code was strict about capacity, and every seat was already filled or spoken for. Pulled out his phone, the latest model that wouldn't be released to the public for another month. He waved it in front of her face, showing her his bank account balance. The numbers were staggering, more money than would see in several lifetimes. He told her he could buy this entire restaurant right now, with cash, and fire her before the transaction even cleared. Felt her face flush with embarrassment and fear. Other guests were definitely watching now. The pianist had even faltered in his playing, missing a note before recovering. She tried to explain again, her voice smaller now, that it wasn't about money. The restaurant simply had no physical space available. The tables were full. Behind, his friends laughed and made crude jokes about the hostess. Brent suggested that maybe she just didn't understand numbers with that many zeros. Justin wondered aloud if she had even graduated high school. Tyler said something about service workers needing to know their place. The restaurant manager, a thin man named with perfectly groomed silver hair, emerged from the back. He had been alerted by one of the servers that there was a situation developing at the front. Had managed La Belle for 15 years and had dealt with difficult guests before, but something about the energy of this confrontation made his stomach tighten with apprehension. He approached with his professional smile firmly in place and greeted by name. He apologized for any inconvenience but confirmed what had said. The restaurant was completely booked. However, if and his friends would like to wait at the bar, there was a possibility that a table might open up if someone canceled. He could offer them complimentary drinks while they waited. Turned his cold gaze to, he said he didn't want to wait at the bar like some nobody. He wanted a table now. His father donated millions to charities in this city. His family name was on hospital wings and museum galleries. Surely could find a way to make room for 4 people. Maintained his composure, though a thin line of sweat appeared on his upper lip. He explained that while he had tremendous respect for the family, he couldn't ask paying guests who had reservations to leave. It would be completely inappropriate and potentially illegal. This was apparently the wrong thing to say. His face flushed red with anger. He raised his voice, no longer caring about discretion or decorum. He called incompetent and threatened to call his father, who knew the restaurant's owner personally. He said heads would roll, starting with Zand. The entire staff would be replaced by morning if he had anything to say about it. The restaurant had gone almost completely silent now. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks were lowered to plates. All eyes turned to the scene unfolding at the entrance. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others curious, a few seemed almost entertained by the drama. His professional mask began to crack. He asked, quietly but firmly, to lower his voice. This kind of behavior was disturbing the other guests. If and his friends couldn't conduct themselves appropriately, he would have to ask them to leave. Wrong Move exploded. He shouted that he wasn't going anywhere. He grabbed the edge of the hostess podium and in a sudden burst of rage shoved it hard. The podium tipped, sending the reservation book, menus, and a small vase of flowers crashing to the marble floor. Water spread across the pristine surface, and glass shattered into hundreds of glittering pieces. Jumped back with a small cry of alarm. His face went pale. Behind them, servers froze in place, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of the way. His friends cheered and laughed as if this was the most entertaining thing they had seen all week. Brent high-fived Justin. Tyler pulled out his phone to record what came next. They encouraged to show these people what real power looked like. Wasn't done. He grabbed several menus from a nearby stand and threw them across the floor. He kicked at a decorative planter, sending dirt and an expensive orchid sprawling across the marble. His movements were wild now, fueled by alcohol, entitlement, and genuine rage that anyone would dare to tell him no. He shouted about how this was what happened when poor people tried to tell rich people what to do. He said they should all be grateful to have jobs, grateful that people like him even bothered to come to their pathetic restaurant. His voice echoed off the high ceilings, vulgar and vicious. Other guests began to murmur. Some pulled out phones, though whether to call for help or simply record the spectacle was unclear. An elderly woman at a nearby table looked genuinely frightened and clutched her husband's hand. A businessman was already on his phone, possibly calling the police. Tried once more to calm the situation. He held up his hands in a placating gesture and said they could work something out. Perhaps a private dining room could be prepared, though it would take 30 minutes. Would and his friends be willing to wait for that? Laughed, but there was no humor in it. He said 30 minutes was unacceptable. Everything was unacceptable. He got what he wanted when he wanted it. He moved toward the main dining room as if he planned to simply take a table by force. Stepped in front of him, trying to block his path without actually touching him. He said he couldn't allow to harass the seated guests. If took one more step, he would have no choice but to call the authorities. Shoved, it wasn't a hard shove, but it was enough to make the older man stumble backward, his arms windmilling as he tried to keep his balance. He caught himself against a wall, breathing hard, his face now flushed with anger and embarrassment. That's when the situation truly spiraled out of control. One of the servers, a young man named, rushed forward to help, turned on him, getting in his face, shouting about how he shouldn't touch him, how he could sue him for assault. Backed away, hands raised, trying to defuse the situation. But was beyond reason now. The alcohol, the refused entry, the perceived disrespect, it all combined into a perfect storm of entitled rage. He grabbed a glass of water from a passing server's tray and threw it against the wall, where it shattered spectacularly. He overturned a small decorative table, sending more glass and flowers cascading to the floor. His friends continued to cheer him on, recording everything on their phones, laughing and making bets about what he would break next. They had seen throw tantrums before, had watched him bully and intimidate service workers, store clerks, anyone who didn't immediately cater to his every whim. To them, this was entertainment, a demonstration of the power they all wielded by virtue of their last names and bank accounts. The restaurant descended into chaos. Guests stood from their tables, some heading for the exits, others simply trying to get out of the way. Servers huddled together near the kitchen doors, unsure what to do. Was on his phone now, presumably calling the owner or the police or both. Had tears streaming down her face as she tried to sweep up broken glass with shaking hands. stood in the center of the destruction he had created, breathing hard, his expensive suit disheveled, his hair falling into his face. He looked around at the frightened faces, the overturned furniture, the shattered glass, and for just a moment something flickered in his eyes. Was it regret? Shame? But then his friends clapped him on the back and praised his performance, and whatever that flicker was, it disappeared. He announced loudly that this was what happened when people forgot their place. This was what happened when you disrespected the family. He suggested that everyone in the restaurant should take a good look and remember this moment the next time they thought about telling him no. In the back of the restaurant, beyond the swinging kitchen doors, a woman named Sarah was finishing her break. Sarah was 35 years old, with warm brown eyes, natural hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a calm demeanor that had been forged through years of dealing with difficult situations. She had worked as a waitress at La Belle for 7 years, longer than almost anyone else on the staff. Sarah had seen a lot in those 7 years. She had served movie stars and politicians, had dealt with demanding customers and unreasonable complaints. She had been yelled at, condescended to, and occasionally subjected to behavior that would have made others quit on the spot. But Sarah had a secret weapon that got her through even the worst shifts. She refused to let other people's chaos disturb her inner peace. She had grown up in a tough neighborhood in Brooklyn, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Sarah had learned early that life wasn't fair, that some people had advantages others would never have, and that getting angry about it only hurt yourself. Her mother had taught her to keep her dignity no matter what, to respond to ugliness with grace, and to never let anyone make you feel small. Sarah heard the commotion from the dining room, the raised voices and shattering glass. The other kitchen staff were gathered at the doors, peeking through the small windows, whispering about what was happening. She heard snippets of their conversation, something about a huge mess, something about looking like he might have a heart attack. She stood up from the small table where she had been eating a sandwich and checking her phone. She smoothed down her uniform, a crisp white shirt and black slacks, and tied her apron more securely around her waist. Several of her tried to stop her as she walked toward the dining room doors. They told her to stay back, that the situation was dangerous, that was out of control. Sarah smiled at them, that same calm smile that had soothed countless nervous customers and diffused countless tense situations. She told them she would just take a look, see if there was anything she could do to help. They shook their heads, certain she was making a mistake, but they knew better than to try to stop Sarah once she had made up her mind about something. She pushed through the swinging doors and stepped into the chaos of the dining room. Her experienced eyes took in the scene instantly, the overturned furniture, the shattered glass, the frightened guests looking shaken and pale, crying near the hostess stand. And in the center of it all, flushed and wild-eyed, surrounded by his laughing friends. Sarah had dealt with men like before, men who thought their money made them gods, men who had never been told no in their entire lives. She had learned that there were 2 ways to handle such people. You could meet their aggression with more aggression, which usually escalated the situation. Or you could respond with such unshakable calm that it completely diffused their anger, like water on fire. She chose the latter approach, as she always did. Sarah walked forward slowly, her footsteps steady and sure on the glass-strewn marble floor. She didn't rush, didn't appear nervous or afraid. She simply walked toward as if she were approaching an old friend, as if there were nothing unusual happening at all. Saw her coming and turned toward her, his face still twisted with anger. He opened his mouth, probably to unleash another verbal attack, to tell this waitress to get out of his way, to threaten her job and her livelihood. But before he could speak, Sarah did something unexpected. She smiled at him, a genius Sarah greeted by name, and mentioned that he looked like he was having a really difficult day. She wondered if maybe he would like to sit down for a moment and catch his breath. Her voice carried no condescension, no sarcasm, just simple human kindness offered to another person who seemed to be struggling. Stared at her, completely thrown off balance. He had been ready for confrontation, for more people telling him he was wrong, for judgment and anger. He wasn't prepared for this calm black woman in a server's uniform to speak to him like he was a person instead of a problem. His mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. His friends noticed the change immediately. Brent stepped forward, ready to jump in with a crude comment about Sarah, probably something about her knowing her place. But Sarah turned her calm gaze to him, and something in her eyes made him stop mid-breath. It wasn't a challenge or a threat. It was just a look that seemed to see right through his bravado to the insecure boy underneath. He fell silent, confused by his own reaction. Sarah turned back to and continued in that same gentle tone. She said she could see he was upset, and that was okay. Everyone got upset sometimes, but breaking things and scaring people wasn't going to make him feel better. In fact, it was probably going to make him feel worse once the adrenaline wore off. She had seen it happen before plenty of times. Tried to summon his anger again. He asked who she thought she was talking to him like that. Did she know how much money he had? Did she know what he could do to her career with one phone call? Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if he had asked a perfectly reasonable question. She said she did know who he was, son of William. She knew he had more money than she would ever see in her lifetime. She knew he could probably get her fired if he really wanted to. And then she added something that made blink in surprise. She said none of that changed the fact that he was standing in the middle of a restaurant, surrounded by broken glass and frightened people, probably feeling pretty awful inside even if he wouldn't admit it. Something in his chest tightened. No one talked to him like this, like they could see past the money and the name and the bravado to the actual person underneath. It was unsettling and weirdly comforting at the same time. He found his anger deflating like a punctured balloon, leaving behind a confused mixture of embarrassment and something else he couldn't quite name. Sarah took a small step closer, careful to avoid the broken glass. She said that she had been working at La Belle for 7 years, and in that time she had seen a lot of people have bad days. Rich people, poor people, famous people, regular people. Everyone had days when things just felt overwhelming, when the world didn't seem to work the way it should, when the smallest inconvenience felt like a personal attack. She said she understood that feeling. She had days like that too, days when she wanted to scream and throw things and make the world understand how frustrated she was. But she had learned something important over the years. That kind of reaction never actually made anything better. It just left you standing in a mess you had created, with everyone around you scared or hurt or angry. Looked around at the destruction he had caused, really looked at it for the first time. He saw, still crying, trying to clean up the mess with shaking hands. He saw, leaning against the wall, looking older and more tired than he had minutes before. He saw the frightened faces of the guests, some of whom had their children with them. He saw his own reflection in a mirror on the wall, hair disheveled, face flushed, eyes wild. He barely recognized himself. Sarah must have seen something change in his expression because she nodded slowly. She said that right now he had a choice. He could keep going down this path, could keep breaking things and shouting, could wait for the police to arrive and potentially face charges. That was one option. Or he could take a breath, step back, and try to fix what he had broken, both literally and figuratively. Justin, sensing the shift tried to pull him back into the chaos. He said they should just leave, go somewhere else where people actually appreciated their business. He said this restaurant was trash anyway, and the staff deserved whatever they got. Tyler agreed loudly, already heading for the door, still recording on his phone. But didn't move. He was staring at Sarah, really looking at her for the first time. He saw the kindness in her eyes, the lack of judgment despite everything he had done. He saw someone who was treating him with more respect and dignity than he had shown anyone in this restaurant. He saw someone who, despite having every reason to be angry with him, was instead offering him a way out of the hole he had dug himself into. Sarah asked him a simple question. She asked if this was really who he wanted to be, someone who scared people, who broke things when he didn't get his way, who used his money and power to hurt others. She said she didn't think it was, because if that was really who he was, he wouldn't still be standing here listening to her. He would have already left or pushed past her to cause more damage. Felt something crack inside him, not like glass breaking, but like ice thawing. His shoulders slumped. The tension drained from his body. He suddenly felt exhausted, hollowed out, like he had been running a marathon and had just realized he was running in the wrong direction. He looked down at his hands, which were shaking slightly. He wasn't even sure if it was from the alcohol or the adrenaline or something else entirely. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, lacking the aggressive edge it had carried before. He said he didn't know what had happened, how things had gotten so out of control. He said he just wanted a table, that was all. He just wanted to have dinner with his friends. Sarah nodded understandingly. She said she knew that, and it was a perfectly reasonable thing to want. But the restaurant really was full, through no fault of anyone there. It wasn't that they didn't want his business or didn't respect him. It was simply a matter of logistics and space. Sometimes, no matter how much money someone had or who their father was, some things just weren't possible in that exact moment. She suggested that maybe this wasn't really about the table at all. Maybe he was dealing with something else, something bigger, and the refused reservation had just been the thing that made it all spill over. That happened sometimes. People carried stress and pressure and expectations until one small thing made it all come crashing out. Looked at her sharply, surprised by her insight. The truth was, he had been fighting with his father all week. William was pushing him to take a more active role in the company, to prove he was worthy of eventually taking over the empire his father had built. But felt lost and directionless, unsure if he even wanted that life, terrified that he would fail if he tried. His father's expectations felt like weights around his neck, dragging him down, and he had no idea how to talk about it or who to talk to about it. So instead, he drank and partied and threw money around, trying to feel powerful in the only way he knew how. But he didn't say any of that to Sarah. He just stood there, feeling more vulnerable than he had in years, completely unsure what to do next. Around them, the restaurant remained silent, everyone watching this strange interaction between the entitled rich kid and the calm waitress who seemed to have somehow diffused a situation that had felt moments away from police involvement. Sarah seemed to understand that was at a crossroads. She made a gentle suggestion. She said that the first step might be to apologize to the people he had frightened and to help clean up the mess he had made. It wouldn't fix everything, but it would be a start. She said she would help him if he wanted, that he didn't have to do it alone. His friends were at the door now, calling for him to come on to leave this dump behind. Brent said something crude about Sarah, a racial slur that made several guests gasp. Turned to look at them, really looked at them. He saw Brent's sneer, Justin's mocking laughter, Tyler still holding up his phone, capturing everything for entertainment value. He saw them clearly for the first time, saw the ugliness that he had been participating in and contributing to for years. He turned back to Sarah and made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He told his friends to leave. He said he was staying to clean up his mess. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. His friends stared at him like he had lost his mind. Brent asked if he was seriously choosing to stay with these people, these service workers who didn't matter. Said yes, he was. He told them to go, that he would catch up with them later, or maybe he wouldn't. He found that he didn't really care either way. After a moment of stunned silence, his friends left, muttering about how it had gone crazy, how they would tell everyone about this, how he was going to regret choosing a waitress over his own friends. The door closed behind them, and the restaurant felt instantly calmer, like a poison had been drained from the room. Turned to Sarah, looking lost and young despite his expensive clothes and watch. He asked what he should do, where he should start. Sarah smiled that warm smile again and said they should probably begin with the people he had scared. She led him over to first. Stood in front of the manager, who regarded him warily, still pressed against the wall as if ready to defend himself. Cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was uncertain, lacking its earlier arrogance. He apologized for pushing him, for threatening him, for everything. He said there was no excuse for his behavior and that he understood if wanted to press charges or ban him from the restaurant permanently. Stared at him, clearly shocked by this turn of events. After a long moment, he straightened up and adjusted his tie with dignity. He said he appreciated the apology and that he would not be pressing charges. However, was indeed banned from La Belle until further notice. If he wanted that ban lifted in the future, he would need to demonstrate genuine change in his behavior and make meaningful amends. Nodded, accepting this consequence without argument. Sarah guided him to Next, who was still kneeling on the floor, trying to clean up the water and broken glass with shaking hands and tears on her cheeks. Knelt down beside her, not caring that his expensive suit pants were getting wet and dirty. He apologized for terrifying her, for making her cry, for destroying the hostess stand and making her work even harder. He said he had been completely wrong and that she had done nothing to deserve his behavior. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, genuine emotion breaking through. Looked up at him, surprised and wary. She nodded slowly, accepting his apology but clearly still shaken. Sarah produced a broom and dustpan from somewhere and handed them too. She suggested he might want to help clean up the glass since he was the one who had broken it. Took the broom without hesitation and began carefully sweeping up the shattered pieces. The sight of Billionaire's son, in his designer suit, sweeping up broken glass in a restaurant, was so surreal that several guests pulled out their phones to take pictures. But Sarah caught their eye and shook her head firmly. There was no judgment in her expression, just a clear message that this young man was trying to do the right thing, and they should let him do it with some dignity. Most of the guests put their phones away, though a few still snapped photos. Continued sweeping, his movements awkward and unpracticed. It was clear he had never cleaned anything in his life, but he was trying. Sarah worked beside him, righting the furniture, salvaging what flowers could be saved, wiping down surfaces. As they worked together in silence, broken only by the quiet conversations of guests who were slowly returning to their meals, Sarah spoke softly so only could hear. She told him that everyone made mistakes, everyone had moments they weren't proud of. What mattered was what you did afterward, how you chose to respond to your own behavior. Paused in his sweeping and looked at her. He asked why she was being so nice to him after everything he had done. He said she had no reason to help him, that most people in her position would have taken satisfaction in watching him face consequences. Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. She said that she had learned something important from her mother, that holding on to anger and resentment hurt you more than it hurt anyone else. She said she could choose to be angry with, to judge him, and write him off as just another spoiled rich kid who would never change. Or she could choose to see him as a person who had made bad choices but who still had the capacity to be better. She said the second option seemed more productive and honestly more interesting. Felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him with such straightforward kindness, without wanting something from him, without judging him based on his last name or bank account. He asked Sarah how she stayed so calm, how she didn't let people like him get to her, how she maintained her dignity in a job where people probably treated her poorly all the time. Sarah smiled and said it was a practice, like meditation or exercise. Some days were easier than others. Some days she went home and cried from frustration or anger. But she always tried to remember that other people's behavior said more about them than it did about her. When someone was cruel or dismissive, it usually meant they were hurting in some way, even if they didn't realize it or couldn't admit it. Responding with more cruelty just added to the hurt in the world. Responding with kindness, or at least with calm dignity, had the potential to heal something. Thought about this as he continued cleaning. He realized he had spent his entire life surrounded by people who responded to every slight with aggression, who used power and money as weapons, who never backed down or admitted wrong. His father operated that way in business, crushing competition and demanding absolute loyalty. His friends treated everyone outside their circle as inferior and disposable. He had absorbed these lessons without questioning them, had assumed this was simply how successful people behaved. But here was Sarah, who probably made in a year what he spent on a weekend, who had every reason to be bitter and angry about the inequality in the world, and yet she radiated more genuine strength and confidence than anyone he knew in his privileged circle. She had diffused his rage not with superior force, but with simple human decency. She had offered him redemption when he probably didn't deserve it. She had treated him like a person worth saving when he had been acting like a monster. The cleanup took almost an hour. Worked alongside Sarah and the staff, doing what he was told, following Sarah's gentle directions. He helped right the furniture, carried the trash bags, even got on his hands and knees to pick up tiny shards of glass that the broom had missed. His suit was ruined, his hands were dirty, and his perfectly when the dining room was finally restored to some semblance of order, though it would need professional cleaning and repairs, stood up and wiped his dirty hands on his ruined pants. He looked around at the staff members who had gathered to watch this bizarre scene. He addressed all of them, his voice humble and sincere. He apologized again for his behavior, for scaring them and disrupting their work, for disrespecting them and the restaurant. He said he would pay for all damages, including any lost business from guests who had left because of him. Who had been watching from a distance with his arms crossed, stepped forward. He said he appreciated his apology and his help with the cleanup, but that actions spoke louder than words. He said if was serious about making amends, there were better ways to do it than just throwing money at the problem. He suggested that might want to think about the privilege he had and how he could use it to help others rather than to intimidate and harm them. Nodded slowly, absorbing this. He asked what he meant, what he could do. Said he didn't have a specific answer, that it was something would need to figure out for himself. But he suggested that spend some time thinking about the people whose labor and service made his comfortable life possible and consider how he might treat them with the respect they deserved. Sarah, who had been standing quietly nearby, added her own thought. She said that one thing could do if he was interested was to volunteer his time helping people less fortunate. She mentioned a community center in Brooklyn where she sometimes volunteered on her days off, helping to serve meals and provide resources to homeless families. She said they always needed help, and that experiencing life from a different perspective might teach him things that money and privilege never could. Looked at her with genuine curiosity. He asked if she was serious, if she really thought someone like him could be helpful in a place like that. Sarah said she didn't know if he would be helpful or not, that depended entirely on his attitude. But she thought it would be good for him to try, to see a world that existed outside his bubble of wealth and entitlement. For the first time that evening, smiled, and it wasn't the arrogant smirk he usually wore, but something genuine and uncertain. He said he would like to try, that he would appreciate the opportunity if Sarah was willing to give him her contact information so he could follow up. Sarah reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a pen. She wrote her phone number on a napkin and handed it too. She told him to text her when he was serious about volunteering, but only if he was really serious. She said she wouldn't waste her time or the time of the people she helped if he was just doing this to make himself feel better or to look good on social media. Took the napkin carefully, as if it were something precious. He promised that if he reached out, it would be genuine. He said he couldn't explain why, but something about this entire experience had shaken him in a way nothing else ever had. He felt like he had been sleepwalking through his life, and Sarah had somehow woken him up. Sarah smiled and said that was a good start, but waking up was just the first step. What mattered was what he chose to do once he was awake. She said she hoped he would make good choices, but that ultimately it was up to him. She couldn't change him or fix him. He would have to do that work himself. Before left, he approached one more time. He pulled out his checkbook, something he rarely actually used since everything was usually handled through apps and credit cards. He wrote a check for an amount that made his eyes widen in shock. He said it was for the damages, for lost business, and for the staff as an apology. He said he hoped it would help, but that he understood if it didn't change anything. Took the check, looked at it, and then looked at with an expression that was hard to read. He said he would accept the money because the restaurant did need repairs, and the staff could use a bonus after the trauma of the evening. But he reiterated that money wasn't the same as change. He said he hoped to see evidence of real change from in the future. Nodded, understanding that he had a long way to go to truly make amends. He said goodbye to the staff, making eye contact with each person and offering individual apologies. When he got to, he paused and told her that she had done nothing wrong, that she had simply been doing her job and that she was good at it. He said he hoped his behavior wouldn't make her afraid to stand up to difficult customers in the future, because people like her deserved to work in environments where they felt safe and respected. Still shaken but somewhat reassured, thanked him quietly. She said she appreciated his apology and hoped he meant what he said about changing. Said he did, though he admitted he wasn't entirely sure what that change would look like yet. He was figuring it out as he went. As walked toward the door, Sarah accompanied him. The restaurant had mostly returned to normal, with guests finishing their meals and new arrivals being seated at the tables that had been reserved all along. The pianist was playing again, filling the elegant space with soft music. It was as if the chaos of an hour ago had been a strange dream, though the tension in the staff's shoulders and the wariness in their eyes proved it had been all too real. At the door, paused and turned to Sarah. He asked her something that had been bothering him. He asked how she knew that being kind to him would work, that he wouldn't just hurt her or ignore her or make things worse. He said she had taken a risk approaching him when he was so out of control. Sarah considered this question seriously. She said she didn't know for certain that it would work. There was always a risk when you chose kindness over aggression, especially with someone who was volatile. But she had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts had told her that underneath all his rage and entitlement was just a confused young man who didn't know how to handle his emotions. She had taken a calculated risk, and fortunately it had paid off. But she admitted that it didn't always work out that way. Sometimes people were too far gone in their anger to hear anything. Sometimes kindness was met with more violence. She had been lucky tonight. Absorbed this, understanding that Sarah had been braver than he had given her credit for. She had risked her safety and her job to reach out to him when she had no obligation to do so. He thanked her, his voice thick with emotion, and told her that she had changed something in him tonight, something fundamental that he couldn't quite name yet, but that he knew was important. Sarah said she hadn't changed him, that he had changed himself by choosing to listen, to stop, to clean up his mess. She had just offered him an opportunity, but he was the one who had taken it. She told him to remember that feeling, that moment of choice, because he would face it again many times in his life. Every day would bring opportunities to choose kindness or cruelty, humility or arrogance, growth or stagnation. The work of becoming a better person never ended. Left the restaurant that evening with his suit ruined and his pride humbled but with something new growing inside him. He walked past the luxury cars lining the street, past the designer shops and expensive galleries, and for the first time in his life, he really saw the people who made this world function. He saw the doorman holding open a door for residents who barely acknowledged him. He saw the food delivery worker rushing to get orders out on time. He saw the custodian emptying trash from the sidewalk receptacle. He saw them, really saw them, as people with lives and struggles and dignity that had nothing to do with their bank accounts. The next few days were strange for. He didn't call his friends, didn't respond to their mocking texts about what had happened at the restaurant. He spent a lot of time alone in his penthouse apartment, thinking about the person he had become and the person he wanted to be. He looked at his life with new eyes and found himself uncomfortable with what he saw. He thought about his father, William, a self-made billionaire who had clawed his way up from poverty to build an empire. His father often told the story of his humble beginnings, using it to justify his ruthless business practices. He would say that he understood hardship, that he had earned his wealth, and therefore he had the right to wield power however he saw fit, but realized that his father had forgotten something essential along the way. He had forgotten the compassion and understanding that should have come from experiencing poverty. Instead, he had developed contempt for anyone who hadn't achieved what he had, as if their struggles were somehow their own fault. Didn't want to become that person. He didn't want to use his advantages as weapons against others. He didn't want to spend his life surrounded by people who only valued him for his money and his name. He wanted to be someone who made the world better, not worse, but he had no idea how to begin. On the fourth day after the restaurant incident, texted Sarah. He kept the message simple, asking if she was serious about the volunteering opportunity and if she could provide details. He sent it in the morning and then spent the entire day nervously checking his phone, worried that she had changed her mind about him or that she had only made the offer out of politeness. Sarah responded that evening, after her shift at the restaurant. She gave him the address of the community center in Brooklyn and told him they served dinner to homeless families every Tuesday and Thursday evening. She said if he wanted to help, he should show up next Tuesday at 5 in the afternoon, ready to work. She warned him that it wouldn't be glamorous or comfortable, that he would be doing dishes, serving food, cleaning tables, and interacting with people whose life experiences were vastly different from his own. She said if he couldn't commit to treating everyone there with respect and dignity, he shouldn't come at all. Assured her he was serious. He said he would be there on Tuesday, and he would do whatever was needed. Sarah sent back a simple thumbs-up emoji and told him to dress casually and to leave his expensive watch and jewelry at home. She said the last thing people struggling with poverty needed was someone flashing wealth in their faces. That Tuesday drove to Brooklyn in a car he rarely used, a modest sedan that had been a gift from his father years ago and that usually sat unused in his building's parking garage. He wore jeans and a plain t-shirt, both of which he had to buy specially since his wardrobe consisted almost entirely of designer suits and expensive casual wear that screamed money. He felt strange and uncomfortable in the ordinary clothes, exposed somehow, as if his wealth had been a suit of armor he was now without. The community center was in a neighborhood had never visited before, despite living in New York his entire life. The building was old but well-maintained, with a cheerful mural painted on one wall and plants in window boxes. People were already gathering outside, families with children, elderly individuals, young adults who looked tired and worn down by life. They chatted quietly among themselves or sat in silence, waiting for the doors to open. Parked a block away and walked toward the building, feeling intensely self-conscious. He felt like everyone could tell he didn't belong here, that his privileged background was written all over him despite his attempt at ordinary clothes. He almost turned around and left several times, convincing himself that this was a mistake, that he had nothing to offer these people, that he would only make things worse with his inexperience and awkwardness. But then he saw Sarah emerging from the building, carrying a box of supplies. She spotted him immediately and smiled, waving him over. The warmth in her greeting gave him courage. She introduced him to the other volunteers, a diverse group of people from different backgrounds who all shared a commitment to helping their community. They welcomed without judgment, though he caught a few curious glances at his expensive sneakers, the one item he hadn't thought to replace. Sarah put him to work immediately. She showed him how to set up the tables, fold napkins, arrange the chairs. Simple tasks, but threw himself into them with unexpected enthusiasm. He found satisfaction in the physical work, in doing something useful with his hands. No one was impressed by his last name here. No one cared about his father's money. What mattered was whether he showed up and did the work. When the doors opened and people began filing in for dinner, felt his nervousness return. He was stationed at the serving line, tasked with spooning vegetables onto plates. The first few people came through and he fumbled with the portions, unsure how much to give. A middle-aged woman gently corrected him, showing him the proper serving size. She thanked him for volunteering, her smile genuine and kind. Felt something warm bloom in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite identify, but that felt remarkably like purpose. Throughout the evening, served food, cleared tables, washed dishes, and talked with people whose lives were nothing like his own. He met a single mother working 3 jobs who still couldn't afford an apartment and was living in a shelter with her 2 children. He met a veteran dealing with PTSD and homelessness who spoke eloquently about the failures of the system designed to help him. He met a young couple who had been evicted when one of them lost their job due to illness, now trying to save enough for a deposit on a new place while living in their car. Each story hit like a punch to the gut. These weren't abstract concepts or statistics. These were real people, people with dreams and talents and bad luck, people who worked hard but couldn't get ahead, people whom the system had failed in ways had never imagined. He found himself unable to fall back on the comfortable narratives he had grown up with, the ideas that poor people were just lazy or that anyone could succeed if they tried hard enough. The reality was so much more complex and painful than he had been taught. After the dinner service ended and the cleaning was done, the volunteers gathered for a quick debriefing. The coordinator, a woman named who had been running the program for 15 years, thanked everyone for their work. She made special mention of welcoming him as a first-time volunteer and praising his hard work. Felt embarrassed but pleased by the recognition, more satisfied by this simple acknowledgement than by all the hollow praise he usually received in his regular life. As people dispersed, Sarah and walked out together into the cool evening air, was quiet, processing everything he had experienced. Sarah asked him what he thought, how it had felt, struggled to find words. He said it had been harder than he expected, not physically but emotionally. He said he felt overwhelmed by the weight of other people's struggles, by the realization of how much suffering existed in the world that he had been completely blind to. Sarah nodded understandingly. She said that feeling was normal, that everyone who volunteered for the first time experienced something similar. The key was not to let that overwhelm turn into despair or paralysis. She said you couldn't fix everything or save everyone, but you could help where you were with what you had. Small actions mattered. Showing up mattered. Treating people with dignity mattered. Asked Sarah how she did it, how she balanced working a demanding job at the restaurant with volunteering her free time, how she maintained her energy and optimism. Sarah laughed and said it wasn't always easy. She said there were weeks when she was exhausted, when she questioned whether her efforts made any real difference. But then she would have a moment, a conversation with someone that reminded her why the work mattered, and she would find her motivation renewed. She told about a teenager named who had been coming to the community center with his grandmother for 2 years, had been angry and sullen at first, convinced the world had nothing good to offer him. But Sarah and the other volunteers had invested time in him, talking to him, encouraging his interest in art, helping him apply for scholarships. Now was in his first year at a community college, studying graphic design, and he volunteered at the center himself. She said that one success story gave her hope for all the others, even when the progress was slow and difficult to see. Absorbed this, understanding that meaningful change happened gradually, through consistent effort and genuine care. It was so different from his world where everything moved fast, where results were expected immediately, where people were judged by quarterly profits and stock prices. This was a different kind of work, requiring patience and faith and a willingness to invest in people without expecting immediate returns. He asked Sarah if he could come back next week, if she thought he had done well enough to be invited again. Sarah smiled and said of course he could come back, that they always needed volunteers. But she had a question for him first. She asked if he was doing this because he genuinely wanted to help or because he was trying to prove something to her or to himself, or to make up for his behavior at the restaurant. Thought carefully about his answer. He said honestly that it was probably all of those things mixed together. He did want to prove he could change, both to Sarah and to himself. He did want to make up for his past behavior, but also, surprisingly, he had genuinely enjoyed the evening despite how challenging it had been. He had felt useful in a way he never felt in his regular life. He had connected with people in real, authentic ways. He wanted more of that feeling. Sarah accepted this answer. She said motivation didn't have to be pure to be valid, that most people did good things for complicated reasons. What mattered was showing up consistently and treating people right. If could do that, his reasons for starting didn't matter as much as his actions along the way. Over the following weeks, became a regular at the community center. He showed up every Tuesday and Thursday without fail, working whatever position was needed. He began to form relationships with the regular guests, learning their names and their stories, celebrating small victories with them, and offering support during setbacks. He found himself thinking about these people during his week, wondering how they were doing, hoping things were getting better for them. His friends noticed his absence from their usual haunts and activities. Brent called him one evening, demanding to know what was going on, accusing of avoiding them since the restaurant incident, tried to explain what he had been doing, why he felt it was important. Brent laughed and said was being ridiculous, wasting his time with losers and charity cases when he could be enjoying his life and his money. He said everyone was talking about how it had gone soft, how that waitress had somehow brainwashed him. Felt anger rising but managed to keep his voice calm. He said he was sorry Brent felt that way, but he didn't consider helping people a waste of time. He said maybe he had gone soft, or maybe he had just woken up to the fact that there were more important things than partying and showing off wealth. He told Brent that he valued their friendship, but that he needed friends who could understand and support the changes he was trying to make. If Brent couldn't do that, then maybe they needed some distance. Brent responded with more mockery and insults before hanging up. Felt sad, but also relieved. He realized he had been keeping toxic people in his life simply because they shared his background, because they were the only people he had known growing up in his rarefied world. But Sarah and the volunteers at the community center had shown him that friendship could be based on shared values and genuine connection rather than shared privilege. Also began to confront his relationship with his father. William had built his empire through aggressive tactics, hostile takeovers, and a philosophy that weakness should be exploited rather than protected. He had always pushed to be harder, tougher, more ruthless. Kindness was weakness in William's worldview. Compassion was something that poor people used to make themselves feel better about their failures. One Sunday, joined his father for their weekly dinner at William's mansion. It was usually a formal, tense affair where William grilled about his plans for joining the company and deflected with vague promises. But this time came with a different agenda. He told his father about the community center, about the volunteering, about the people he had met, and the things he had learned. William listened with increasing disapproval, his expression darkening. When finished, William set down his fork carefully and asked if had lost his mind. He said that helping homeless people was fine as a tax write-off or a photo opportunity, but actually spending time with them, actually getting involved, was beneath the name. William said that needed to understand something fundamental about the world. There were winners and losers, and the family were winners. They had clawed their way to the top, and they stayed at the top by being smarter, tougher, and more determined than everyone else. Helping losers didn't change them into winners. It just wasted time and resources that could be better used to maintain the family's position and power. Felt something harden in his chest as he listened to his father's words. For the first time, he heard the cruelty underneath the business philosophy, the complete lack of empathy that had allowed his father to succeed so spectacularly while leaving so many casualties in his wake. He understood that his father genuinely believed what he was saying, that he saw the world as a zero-sum game where kindness was stupidity and compassion was weakness. Took a deep breath and told his father that he disagreed. He said he had spent his whole life believing what his father believed, acting like winners were superior to losers, and it had turned him into a person he was ashamed to be. He described the incident at the restaurant, the rage and entitlement and casual cruelty, and how Sarah had shown him a different way of being. William interrupted, saying that the waitress had manipulated, that she probably wanted money or connections or something from him. He said was being naive if he thought people from that background actually cared about him rather than what he could do for them. He warned that he was being taken advantage of, that his newfound conscience was actually just gullibility. Felt his anger rise but kept his voice steady. He said that Sarah had never asked him for anything, that she treated him with more honesty and integrity than most people in their social circle did. He said maybe the problem wasn't that he was being manipulated, but that he had finally met someone who saw him as a person rather than as a checkbook or a connection. He told his father that he didn't want to take over the company if it meant becoming like William, if it meant treating people as disposable resources, if it meant losing his humanity in pursuit of profit. He said he wanted to find a different path, one where he could use his privilege and resources to actually help people rather than to dominate them. William's face flushed with anger. He said was throwing away his birthright, disappointing everyone who had invested in his future. He said if wanted to waste his life playing saint with poor people, he could do it without the family resources. He threatened to cut off financially if he continued down this path. Felt fear grip his stomach. He had never had to support himself, never had to worry about money or survival. The thought of losing his financial safety net was terrifying, but he looked at his father's cold, angry face and realized something important. He could be afraid and still do the right thing. Fear didn't have to control his choices. He told his father that he hoped it wouldn't come to that he loved him and appreciated everything he had been given. But he couldn't continue living a life that went against his emerging values. He said he would rather be poor and decent than rich and cruel. He stood up from the table and left before his father could respond, his hands shaking but his resolve firm. That night lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had just made a terrible mistake. His father rarely made empty threats. It was entirely possible that by morning his credit cards would be canceled, his trust fund frozen, his comfortable life dismantled. The thought was terrifying, but underneath the fear was something else, something that felt almost like freedom. He called Sarah, knowing it was late but needing to talk to someone who might understand. She answered on the third ring, her voice sleepy but concerned. He apologized for calling so late and then told her everything about the dinner with his father, about the ultimatum, about his fear and uncertainty. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said something that surprised him. She said she was proud of him for standing up to his father, but she wanted to make sure he understood what he might be facing. She said poverty wasn't romantic or ennobling. It was hard and grinding and exhausting. If his father followed through on his threat, would be facing challenges he had never imagined. She said she could help him if it came to that. She could show him how to budget, how to find affordable housing, how to navigate a world without money. But she wanted him to really think about whether he was ready for that reality. Standing on principle was admirable, but he needed to understand the practical implications of his choice. Appreciated her honesty. He said he didn't know if he was ready, that he was terrified of losing everything he had taken for granted his whole life. But he knew he couldn't go back to being the person he was before. That version of himself was dead, killed in a restaurant by a kind waitress who had shown him what real strength looked like. He would rather face poverty than resurrect that angry, entitled, cruel version of. Sarah told him to get some sleep and to call her in the morning. She said they would figure things out together, whatever happened. She said he wasn't alone, that he had people who cared about him now, people who valued him for who he was becoming rather than for what he had. Felt tears prick his eyes at her words. He thanked her and hung up, feeling a little less afraid. Morning came and his worst fears were realized. His credit cards were declined when he tried to buy coffee. His access to his trust fund was blocked when he tried to check his account. His father had sat in his penthouse apartment, looking around at the expensive furniture, the original artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows with their million-dollar view of Central Park. None of it belonged to him anymore, not really. It was all tied to his father's money, his father's name, his father's approval. He called the building manager and asked how long he had before he would need to vacate. The answer was 30 days, after which the apartment would revert to his father's control. 30 days to figure out his entire life. The enormity of the challenge threatened to overwhelm him. But then he thought about the people he had met at the community center, people who faced challenges like this every day, who survived and persevered with far fewer resources than he still had. If they could do it, so could he. He called Sarah, who answered immediately. She had been expecting his call. He told her that his father had followed through on the threat, that he had 30 days to find a new place to live and figure out how to support himself. Sarah asked what skills he had, what kind of work he could do. The question stumped him. He had a degree from an expensive private university, but he had coasted through without learning much. He had never actually held a real job, never had to submit a resume or go through an interview. Sarah didn't judge him for this. She simply said they would start from where he was and build from there. She suggested he might start by looking for entry-level positions in restaurants or retail, places that would hire people without much experience. The pay wouldn't be great, but it would be something. She said she could ask around at La Belle to see if they had any openings, though she wasn't sure how would feel about hearing given their history. Said he appreciated that, but he wanted to find something on his own, to prove he could do it without relying on connections or favors. Sarah respected this, saying it showed good character. She told him to start applying to jobs online and to be honest in interviews about his lack of experience but willing to learn. She said his education and work ethic at the community center would count for something. Over the next week, threw himself into job hunting with the same intensity he brought to everything he did. He created a resume that was embarrassingly sparse, filled with volunteer work and vague descriptions of his time in college. He applied to dozens of positions: server, host, retail associate, barista, warehouse worker, anything that might hire him. The interviews were humbling. Managers looked at his expensive clothes and watch, asked about the gap in his employment history, raised eyebrows at his prestigious university and lack of work experience. Several asked him directly why someone with his obvious privilege was applying for minimum wage work. Struggled to explain without sounding crazy or privileged. He settled on saying he was estranged from his family and needed to support himself. This seemed to satisfy most interviewers, though he could see the skepticism in their eyes. He received several rejections, the emails polite but firm. He wasn't qualified. They had more experienced candidates. They didn't think it would be a good fit. Each rejection stung more than he expected. He had never been rejected for anything in his life, had never been told he wasn't good enough. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Sarah checked in with him daily, offering encouragement and practical advice. She helped him revise his resume, taught him how to present himself in interviews, reminded him that rejection was part of the process and didn't reflect his worth as a person. She also started teaching him practical life skills he had never needed before: how to cook simple meals, how to use public transportation, how to shop for groceries on a budget. Was amazed by how much he didn't know about basic survival. He had never cooked a meal, never taken a subway, never looked at prices in a grocery store. Everything that he had taken for granted, the staff who cooked his meals, the drivers who took him places, the unlimited budget for whatever he wanted, all of it was gone. He felt like a child learning to walk, stumbling through tasks that everyone else found routine. But he also felt something unexpected growing inside him: pride. When he successfully cooked his first edible meal, just pasta with store-bought sauce, he felt more accomplished than he had after any of his previous achievements. When he navigated the subway system without getting lost, he felt genuinely clever. These small victories, meaningless to most people, felt monumental to him. He continued volunteering at the community center, though now he understood the guests there in a completely different way. He was one bad month away from needing their services himself. The realization was both terrifying and oddly comforting. He wasn't separate from these people. He was connected to them in ways he had never understood before. One of the regular volunteers, a man named David who worked as a teacher during the day, took an interest in situation. David had noticed transformation over the weeks, how he had gone from awkward and uncertain to competent and committed. When he learned that was job hunting, David offered to help him network. It turned out that David's brother-in-law owned a small nonprofit that provided job training and placement for disadvantaged youth. They needed someone to help with administrative work and program coordination. The pay was modest but decent, and the work was meaningful. Jumped at the opportunity. He interviewed with David's brother-in-law, a man named Carlos who was direct and no-nonsense. Carlos asked tough questions about his background, his motivations, his commitment. Answered honestly, holding nothing back. He talked about the restaurant incident, about Sarah, about his falling out with his father, about his desire to do something meaningful with his life. Carlos listened carefully, then asked one final question. He asked if understood that working for a nonprofit meant long hours, limited resources, and constant frustration with systems that didn't work properly. He asked if was prepared for that reality or if he would quit the moment things got difficult. Thought about everything he had experienced over the past month: the humiliation of job rejections, the fear of poverty, the hard work of learning basic life skills. He thought about the people at the community center who faced far greater challenges every day without quitting. He told Carlos that he couldn't promise he would never get frustrated or discouraged, but he could promise he wouldn't quit just because things were hard. He said he was committed to building a life based on values rather than comfort, and this job aligned with those values. Carlos studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. He said was hired, starting next Monday. The relief felt was overwhelming. He thanked Carlos profusely, promising he wouldn't regret the decision. Carlos smiled and said everyone deserved a second chance, and he believed in people's capacity to change. He had seen too many people written off by society go on to do amazing things. He was willing to bet on transformation. Called Sarah immediately after leaving the interview. She was at work but took a quick break to answer. When he told her about the job, he could hear the genuine happiness in her voice. She said she was proud of him, that he had worked hard and earned this opportunity. She asked him how he felt. Tried to find words for the complex emotions swirling inside him. He said he felt scared but excited, nervous but hopeful. He said he felt like he was standing at the beginning of a completely different life, one that he was building himself rather than inheriting. He said it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. With his job secured, turned his attention to finding a place to live. His 30 days were almost up, and he needed to vacate the penthouse. With his modest salary, he could afford a small studio apartment in a neighborhood far from where he had grown up. Sarah helped him apartment hunt, teaching him how to evaluate listings, how to negotiate with landlords, how to spot red flags. They found a place in Queens, a tiny studio in an older building with creaky floors and neighbors whose conversations could be heard through the thin walls. It was nothing like the penthouse, but it was his, paid for with money he would earn himself. Signed the lease with hands that shook slightly, committing to this new life in an official, binding way. Moving day was both sad and liberating. Packed up his belongings, realizing how few of them he actually needed or wanted. He donated most of his designer clothes, keeping only a few items. He left behind the expensive artwork and furniture that belonged to his father's world. He took his books, some photos, and a few personal items that held genuine meaning. Sarah showed up to help him move, along with David and a few other volunteers from the community center. They loaded everything into a borrowed van and drove to Queens, chatting and laughing, treating it like an adventure rather than a descent into poverty. Felt overwhelmed by their kindness, by the fact that these people had shown up for him without expecting anything in return. As they unloaded boxes into his tiny new apartment, looked around at the peeling paint and the small windows and the kitchen that was barely more than a hot plate and a mini fridge. Then he looked at Sarah and David and the others, all of whom had become genuine friends over the past month. He realized he had more here in this cramped studio with these good people than he had ever had in the penthouse with his wealth and his toxic friends. That evening, after everyone left, sat alone in his new apartment. He had an air mattress to sleep on until he could afford a proper bed. He had a lamp and not much else in terms of furniture. The neighborhood sounds filtered through the windows, car horns and distant music and people talking on the street. It was so different from the hushed luxury of his previous life. He pulled out his phone and looked at his bank account. After paying his deposit and first month's rent, he had a few $100s left until his first paycheck. It wasn't much, but it was his. He thought about calling his father, about apologizing and accepting the terms of returning to the family, about reclaiming the comfortable life he had walked away from. But then he thought about who he would have to become to do that. He would have to resurrect the entitled cruel who had thrown a tantrum in a restaurant. He would have to abandon the values he had worked so hard to develop. He would have to betray the person Sarah had helped him become. The thought made him feel sick. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, checking to make sure he was settled and reminding him that she was proud of him. Smiled and responded, thanking her for everything. He thought about how none of this would have happened if she hadn't approached him that day in the restaurant, if she hadn't seen past his rage to the struggling person underneath, if she hadn't offered him a path toward redemption. Started his new job the following Monday, nervous but determined. The nonprofit, called Futures Forward, worked with teenagers from low-income neighborhoods, providing them with job training, mentorship, and placement services. His role was to help coordinate the programs, manage scheduling, and assist with administrative tasks. It was detail-oriented work that required patience and organization, skills he had never developed before. Carlos proved to be a demanding but fair boss. He expected excellence but was willing to teach and guide. He pushed to learn quickly but also recognized when he needed support. The work was challenging in ways hadn't anticipated. The systems were frustrating, the resources always insufficient, the needs always greater than what they could provide. But it was also deeply rewarding. worked directly with the teenagers in the program, helping them prepare for job interviews, reviewing their resumes, practicing their professional communication skills. Many of these kids reminded him of the teenager Sarah had told him about, angry at the world but hungry for opportunity. He saw how much potential they had, how much talent was being wasted because of circumstances beyond their control. One teenager in particular, a girl named Destiny, caught attention. She was 17, brilliant, but failing most of her classes because she worked 30 hours a week to help support her family. She wanted to be a lawyer but couldn't see a path from her current situation to law school. Started staying late to tutor her, helping her catch up on her schoolwork, talking through her options and strategies. Destiny was suspicious of at first, unable to understand why this college-educated man was working at a nonprofit for modest pay and spending his free time helping her. Was honest with her about his background, about his journey from entitled rich kid to his current life. Destiny listened with interest, then said something that stuck with. She said that people who had everything handed to them usually didn't appreciate it, but people who chose a harder path because it was right, those were people worth respecting. Months passed, settled into his new life, finding a rhythm and routine that felt sustainable. He made friends in his neighborhood, other young people working entry-level jobs and trying to make it in an expensive city. They would gather in someone's apartment to share potluck dinners, commiserating about bad bosses and difficult customers, supporting each other through the challenges of independent adulthood. Continued volunteering at the community center every week, now understanding the work from a completely different perspective. He no longer felt like an outsider looking in. He was part of the community now, someone who understood struggle firsthand, someone whose empathy came from experience rather than abstract sympathy. His relationship with Sarah deepened into genuine friendship. They spent time together outside of the community center, taking walks through the city, having long conversations about life and values, and the challenge of living with integrity in a complicated world. Sarah shared more about her own story, the difficulties she had faced, the choices she had made to maintain her dignity and principles despite the hardships. Asked her once why she worked at such an expensive restaurant when she clearly had philosophical issues with that world of wealth and privilege. Sarah smiled and said it was complicated. The job paid well compared to other server positions, and the better pay allowed her to volunteer more, to help more people. She said she didn't judge the wealthy guests at La Belle, though some of them made it difficult. She saw her role as maintaining her own integrity and dignity regardless of how others behaved. And if she could occasionally reach someone the way she had reached, that made it worthwhile. One evening, about 6 months after had started his new life, Sarah invited him to a small celebration at the community center. The teenager she had mentored was graduating from community college and had been accepted to a 4-year university with a full scholarship to study graphic design. Had organized a party to celebrate his success, inviting all the volunteers and guests who had supported him along his journey. At the party, watched speak about his experience. The young man talked about how close he had come to giving up, how the world had seemed designed to keep him down. But the people at the community center had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. They had shown him that his background didn't determine his future, that he could build a life based on his talents and work ethic rather than the circumstances of his birth. He said he planned to come back after college and help other kids like him find their path. The room erupted in applause, everyone celebrating his achievement. Found himself with tears in his eyes, moved by the young man's resilience and by the collective effort that had made his success possible. This was what meaningful work looked like: patient investment in another person's potential, support without expectation of return, celebration of achievements that would never make headlines but that changed individual lives completely. After the party, Az and Sarah walked to the subway together, told her that he understood now what she had been trying to teach him that day in the restaurant. She asked what he meant. He said she had been trying to show him that every person had dignity and worth regardless of their bank account or social status, that kindness wasn't weakness but strength, that making the world better required choosing compassion over cruelty even when it cost you something. Sarah smiled and said he had learned well. She said she was proud of the person he had become, that the transformation she had witnessed over the past 6 months was remarkable. She said most people never changed, they just became more entrenched in their patterns, but had been willing to question everything, to rebuild himself from the ground up, to choose difficulty over comfort because it aligned with his values. Asked her if she thought his father would ever understand why he had made these choices. Sarah considered the question. She said that some people were too invested in their worldview to change it, that William had built his entire identity and empire on a particular philosophy, and admitting it was flawed would require dismantling too much. But she said that didn't mean had made the wrong choice. Sometimes you had to live your values regardless of whether others understood or approved. They parted ways at the subway station, Sarah heading to Brooklyn and to Queens. As rode the train home, he looked at the other passengers, seeing their humanity in a way he never had before. The tired worker heading home from a late shift, the student bent over a textbook, the elderly woman clutching her shopping bags. Each one had a story, struggles, dreams, dignity. He was no better than any of them, no matter what his last name was or how much money his father had. Pulled out his phone and did something he had been considering for weeks. He typed a message to his father. It was brief, not apologetic, but not angry either. He said he hoped William was well. He said he wanted his father to know that he was doing okay, that he had found work and a place to live, that he was building a life he was proud of. He said he understood if William couldn't support his choices, but he hoped that someday his father might understand that this path, though difficult, was right for him. He said he loved him and hoped they could find a way back to each other eventually, but only if it could be on terms that respected who had become. He hesitated for a moment before hitting send. This message wouldn't change anything immediately. His father might not even respond. But it felt important to reach out, to leave the door open for eventual reconciliation while maintaining his boundaries and values. He pressed send and put his phone away, not expecting a response but feeling lighter for having tried. When arrived home, he found Destiny waiting outside his building, looking nervous. She said she hoped it was okay that she had come by, that she needed to talk to someone, and he was the first person she thought of. Invited her up to his tiny apartment, offered her the folding chair that was his only furniture, and asked what was wrong. Destiny explained that she had been accepted to a prestigious university with a good financial aid package, but it wouldn't cover everything. She would still need several $1,000s for books, housing deposits, and other expenses. Her family couldn't help, and she was worried she would have to turn down the opportunity and stay in the city, continuing to work and go to community college part-time. Listened to her story, feeling the weight of her disappointment. A few months ago, he could have written a check to cover her expenses without blinking, and it would have meant nothing to his bank account. Now he had less than $1,000 to his name, but he understood the value of money and sacrifice in a way he never had before. He told Destiny that he couldn't give her the money she needed, that he didn't have it to give. He saw disappointment flash across her face before she hid it behind a brave smile. But then he said he could help her in a different way. He could help her apply for additional scholarships, could connect her with Carlos and the resources at Futures Forward, could teach her how to advocate for herself with the university's financial aid office. He spent the next hour with Destiny, making a plan. They researched scholarship opportunities, drafted emails to the university, identified potential sources of support. It wasn't a check that solved everything instantly, but it was real help, the kind of support that taught skills while addressing problems. When Destiny left, she hugged tightly and thanked him. She said he had given her hope, which was more valuable than money. Closed the door behind her and sat down on his air mattress, thinking about how his role in helping people had changed. He couldn't be a savior throwing money at problems anymore, but he could be a guide and supporter, someone who had walked a difficult path and could help others navigate their own journeys. That night, as fell asleep, he thought about the restaurant where this all began, about Sarah approaching him in the midst of his chaos, about the choice she had offered him. He thought about how easy it would have been to ignore her, to continue down the path he was on, to stay in the comfortable bubble of wealth and entitlement. He thought about how much he would have missed, how hollow his life would have remained. He didn't regret his choices, despite the difficulty. He had traded comfort for authenticity, wealth for integrity, privilege for purpose. He had learned that real power wasn't found in money or status, but in the ability to choose kindness, to maintain dignity, to live according to your values even when it cost you everything. Who had once sparked chaos in a restaurant out of entitlement and rage, fell asleep in his tiny Queens apartment feeling richer than he ever had in the penthouse. He had work that mattered, friends who truly knew him, a community he belonged to. He had learned what Sarah had tried to teach him that evening, that the measure of a person wasn't found in their bank account, but in how they treated others, especially those who could do nothing for them in return. And somewhere across the city, Sarah finished her shift at La Belle, changed out of her uniform, and headed home. She thought about and smiled, grateful that she had trusted her instincts that evening months ago, grateful that she had chosen to respond to his chaos with calm, grateful that she had offered him a chance at redemption. She had seen the potential in him when he couldn't see it himself, and watching him fulfill that potential had been one of her life's great joys. The next day's phone buzzed with a message from his father. It was brief, just a few words, acknowledging that he had received his message and asking if they could meet for coffee sometime. It wasn't an apology or an acceptance of his choices, but it was something. It was a small opening, a possibility of eventual understanding. Responded that he would like that, suggesting a date and a small coffee shop in Manhattan, neutral territory where they could talk as equals rather than as disappointed father and disobedient son. Whether reconciliation was possible remained to be seen, but was willing to try on his own terms, as the person he had worked so hard to become and decisively, just as he always did in business. A message was waiting from William, brief and cold, saying that was welcome to return to the family when he came to his senses and stopped this foolish crusade. Until then, he was on his own. Sarah watched throughout the evening, noting how he interacted with the guests with genuine interest and respect. She saw him kneel down to talk to a shy child, saw him listen intently to an elderly man's story, saw him work tirelessly at the sink washing dishes without complaint. She saw something in him that maybe he didn't even see in himself yet, the potential to be truly decent, to use his privilege for good rather than harm. Hair was falling in his face. He looked nothing like the polished billionaire's son who had walked in, demanding a warm smile that reached her eyes. And then she spoke, her voice low and calm and completely devoid of judgment or fear.